Klein's conception of envy is that it's the angry feeling that another person possesses and enjoys something desirable, the envious impulse being to take it away or to spoil it. Greed she describes as an impetuous and insatiable craving exceeding what the subject needs and what the object is able and willing to give. She says that greed is mainly bound up with introjection and envy with projection. To restate this then, greed is about never being able to internalize enough of the good object in order to create a sense of a good self through introjection, while envy is a more complicated concept. Klein describes how idealization follows from persecutory anxiety, that it's a consequence of fear, a defense against fantasies of persecution that have been constructed from neglect, for example. In this way, an absence of the mother has been turned into a monster. The same kind of transformation underpins idealization, that just as a monster may rise out of the darkness, so a fairy godmother might set the world to rights. The more disturbed the facilitating environment, the more diametrically monstrous and enviably life-giving the object becomes, making a manageable delineation between good and bad impossible at times. The idealized part of this split can then be envied. So to continue in Klein's own words, she says that the capacity for love gives impetus both to integrating tendencies and to a successful primal splitting between the loved and hated object. This sounds paradoxical, but since integration is based on a strongly rooted good object that forms the core of the ego, a certain amount of splitting is essential for integration. For it preserves the good object and later on enables the ego to synthesize the two aspects of it. Excessive envy and expression of destructive impulses interferes with the primal split between good and bad breast, and the building up of a good object cannot sufficiently be achieved. Thus the basis is not laid for a fully developed and integrated adult personality. Klein then describes how guilt fits into this picture. She says, "It is my hypothesis that one of the deepest sources of guilt is always linked with the envy of the feeding breast, and with the feeling of having spoilt its goodness by envious attacks. If the primal object has been established with relative stability in early infancy, the guilt aroused by such feelings can be coped with more successfully, because then envy is more transient and less liable to endanger the relation to the good object." The penis is elevated to the status of the breast in Klein's post-Freudian conception of the early Oedipus complex, as a part object that can be idealized. From our modern post-feminist perspective, this is problematic. The infant, after all, has actual experience of a feeding breast, and the link of meaning that this creates is clearly fundamental to the infant's development. Conversely, the infant should have no reason to connect oral desire with a penis at this stage of psychic development unless sexual abuse is a significant factor. And if we take Bion's later post-Kleinian development that it is the link of feeding rather than the breast as a pictogram or ideogram that creates the meaning, then what exactly is the role of the penis as a part object at this stage of development? If we take a Jungian archetypal view, we can see perhaps how an innate organizing principle in a social collective unconscious might operate. For instance, a father or hero quality that the baby may from pre-birth have a template for to grow into a sense of maleness. But the role of the penis as an instrument of procreation seems to me far too specific to be given the task of galvanizing these aspects of a male archetype. This, however, despite its anachronistic and possibly perverse feel to a modern reader, is unfortunately the model that Klein builds on to construct her concept of the combined object. And this piece of theory is intrinsic to Steiner's later concept of the psychic retreat. But also, it is, I believe, on a very practical level, observable in adults with psychotic features in confused states of mind, where they have difficulty distinguishing between self and other, inside and outside, good and bad. In short, where normal splitting has become merged. So, in Klein's terms, the influence of the combined parent figure on the infant's ability to differentiate between the parents and to establish good relations with each of them is affected by the strength of envy and the intensity of his Oedipus jealousy. For the suspicion that the parents are always getting sexual gratification from one another reinforces the fantasy, derived from various sources, that they are always combined. If these anxieties are strongly operative, and therefore unduly prolonged, the consequence may be a lasting disturbance in the relation to both parents. In very ill individuals, the inability to disentangle the relationship because of their being intrinsically interlinked in the patient's mind plays an important role in severe states of confusion. To summarize now where we have got to, I described in the second podcast how annihilatory anxiety threatens the infantile self and how splitting occurs as a result, and that the bad part of that split can be evacuated, can be projected into the container, or in fantasy into the mother's or therapist's body. I also described how its affect as a physical or somatic externalization of that internal emotional state that gets used as a vehicle to transfer information between one physical body and another. So, in this way, countertransference occurs through projective processes within a psychodynamic relationship. This affect conveys very well the intensity of any distress, and this can happen musically or through any other behavior, but not the specific reason for that distress. Instead, the therapist's internal object relationships are triggered, and powerful feelings like shame or disgust, envy or guilt may well be experienced as a response to a needy or demanding patient, for example. Depending on our ability as therapists to recognize and bear our own internal state without acting out rather than witnessing our response and considering that it may well be the expected reaction, in other words, a projective identification, the mirror to a patient's evacuation. Shame, for example, at the patient's disgust, may well be vital information to the intensity of the patient's shame that needs to be worked through within the containment of the therapist-patient intersubjective partnership. And this can only happen if the therapist has been trained to recognize these powerful unconscious motivators. We've also now seen how a mother's preoccupation, or a therapist's preoccupation with their own internal objects, can also be considered a threat to the baby's growing ego and thought about as a function of Klein's archaic Oedipal struggle. We've also considered in both recent podcasts how the mother's ability to give, her generosity, can be idealized. And what we mean by this is that the infant sews together the shaky bits of good object they are able to internalize from the sea of persecution derived from the neglect, from a lack of warmth, empathy, continuity in the facilitating environment. And how this idealization can stimulate envy. And then envious attacks can be perpetrated in fantasy that then stimulate guilt. Lastly, we've seen how a combined object, the penis in the breast, excludes the early ego and might threaten the infant's survival, but also disturb the normal splitting of good and bad, and therefore the most basic building blocks of an identity. In this way, I think we can say that confusional states join a primal fear of death, shame and envy as the main antagonists in the building of a psychic